Good evening. My name is Jermaine Braffett. I am a final year student at the University of Guyana, and as a part of my special art course, I am required to do a video on my final paper, which is based on the presentation of transgender in the movies Boys Don't Cry, written and directed by Kimberly Pierce and Andy Benin, and Flawless, written and directed by Joel Schumacher. And this information will be juxtaposed with views expressed in Dave Chappelle's stand-up comedy. So, before I get into the discussion based on the movies, let's have a quick discussion on what transgender is. So, transgender is a term that refers to a spectrum of individuals who express gender in ways that deviate from the gender binary, which includes transsexuals, cross-dressers, and others. This is from Tewksbury and Gain, 1996. This contradicts the social system where males present themselves as masculine and females are supposed to present themselves, of course, as feminine. Thus, a transgender man would be one who's born a female but identifies as a male, which is exactly the case that we find in the movie Boys Don't Cry. So, transgenderism, of course, is a term that was created, so as to label what is deemed as a condition that the transgender persons face. So, very quickly, let's talk about, give context to the two movies that I just listed. So, Boys Don't Cry is actually based on a true story. The character Tina Brandon, who identifies as Brandon because it's a transgender man, is very popular in tiny Nebraska, and of course he does all the things that white males are stereotypically that we're accustomed to seeing white males do, which include drinking, cussing, charming young ladies, etc. The conflict comes about where two males in the movie find out that Brandon is actually Tina Brandon, and then they rape and kill the leading role, the transgender man. Flawless is less gloomy. It's about a retired security guard who's played by Robert De Niro, who suffers a massive stroke and befriends a transgender woman who he didn't get along with in the early parts of the film because he's highly homophobic. And the transgender woman gives him singing lessons so as to recover from the stroke. And the two of them become so much of good friends that Robert De Niro's character takes a bullet for the transgender man. So we have the same theme of acceptance, it's just less gloomy, as I mentioned before. So let's get into our discussion now that we have context of both the movies and what transgenderism is. So, first and foremost, in the film Boys Don't Cry, Tina Brandon is the lead role, as I mentioned before, and is a transsexual man. As such, apart from dressing like a southern white male, acts the part. We're talking about bar fights and getting in trouble with the law. He was supposed to turn up to court and didn't. So, of course, also there's the physical attraction towards females. So this persona matches Brandon's claim throughout the movie that he's a boy. So throughout the film, he doesn't only refute any claims of him being a girl, but he also lies about having male genitals constantly until he's forced to describe his rape, which is the only time in the film that he mentions that he actually has a vagina, of course, because he's actually female. In the film Flawless, the leading role, Rusty, was one of the many transgender characters. There were many of them. Unlike the other movie, there wasn't this stereotypical role played as it relates to gender. All of the transgender females portrayed bold personalities with loud temperaments. Unlike the first movie that sought to critique stereotypes based on gender, this created on uh, a stereotype based on the transgender community, since all the characters depicted the same aggressive, vulgar personas. Interestingly, Rusty provides his take on what she believes she is. So, Rusty says that she doesn't like the term drag queen. She doesn't believe she's a drag queen. She believes she's a female impersonator. She impersonates the embodiment of what a female is supposed to be until she completes her sex change, which interestingly is the conflict of the movie, because she found some drug money and was hiding it in order to be able to use it to complete her sex change, which she says is going to turn her into a brand new woman. So she's an impersonator until she completes the sex change to become a brand new woman. These varying ways of defining transgender used by both the movies are very refreshing. They help to present, for the most part, a positive outlook on what transgenderism is, as these characters struggle to find themselves in a world that is confused about what they are. Viewers are able to relate and to join in and help them discover themselves. So I mentioned before that there's going to be juxtaposition between the movies and Dave Chappelle's Netflix special. So let's see what Chappelle says transgenderism is, or what a transgender is. In his next Netflix special, Equanimity, he gives a layman view of what he thinks transgender is. So he says, they are born feeling like they are something other than they are born as. This is essential to the point of transgenderism. If we are to consider the term gender as both social and biological constructs, then it means that we accept the premise that there are factors and attributes that go along with that construct, those factors being biological and behavioral. Therefore, when the innate behavior contradicts the pre-existing factor, then transgenderism is created. Both movies, along with Chappelle's special, present the same idea, and that is the gender given to transgender individuals at birth are not the genders that they would like to conform to. Thus, there's an innate desire to both internalize who they are and be accepted for their decision. The views expressed in Chappelle's special can be seen as embracing the conservative theory. So let's talk quickly about the conservative theory. The conservative theory is a biased theory for the pre-existing or the already established. Thus, it is a theory that rebukes drastic change. Writer Godfrey Bennon discusses the types of conservative theories and had this to say about the practical theory. He says, the second form of conservatism we term practical. It involves an empirical claim about positive costs of departure from the status quo, deriving from seeing status quo as a social equilibrium involving conventions and recognizing the cost of shifting from one convention equilibrium to another. Again, the relevant costs here are defined in terms of values held in common with non-conservatives. The distinctive practical conservative contribution involves sensitivity to the idea that social outcomes are equilibria, and as such, they exercise some magnetic pull. Again, that's from Bennon. The premise here is that diverting from the normal has serious consequences on social normality. Thus, conservatives argue towards retaining social constructs such as gender. So if you're born a male, the conservatives argue that you should identify as a male so as to keep that social equilibrium intact. One of the most interesting things presented in both movies is the way violence is perpetuated towards the transgender community. In both films, transgender characters are met with gruesome levels of violence. In Boys Don't Cry, as I mentioned before, and again, it's based on a true story. Brandon is raped and later killed for being a woman who presents herself as a man. These acts are a way of dismissing the idea of gender crisis and indicating that there's a vivid distinction between what she is and who they believe she is pretending to be. While in the case of the other movie, Rusty finds himself with an abusive married man who uses her for her money. These films help to shed light on the difficult lives that the transgender members of the transgender community, the kind of lives that they live, and the kind of violence that they are met with. Apart from physical violence, there's also neglect. Rusty, in one scene, talks about the fact that she was never really loved by her parents, that did not agree with her social or sexual preference. In addition to that, the movie's plot was based on the fact that Robert De Niro's character, who was her neighbor, was discriminating against her throughout the first half of the film until it he actually got to know the transgender woman. He then realizes that he then realized that Rusty was a nice person and a very trustworthy friend. Um, Brandon, Tina Brandon in Boys Don't Cry also had his struggles. We are told by his friend that his mother locked him up, and Brandon often indicates that he has nowhere else to go. So there's no one that he can count on because society doesn't deem him as what he presents himself as. The neglect and isolation that they feel are a direct reaction to the fact that they are transgender. Society has become highly reliant on binary systems created to categorize individuals as either male or female. This is one of the foundational concepts to understanding human behavior and establishing social differences between man and woman. Thus, when individuals perceive their gender is flawed, it flies in the face of that very construct. And that's where we find society starts to lash out at these individuals. In previous years, individuals that opposed gender constructs were seen as nuisances to society. The issue is, we as a society believe that we have no social space for a person who is neither man nor woman. This is from Lauber 1994. Thus, it is believed that it would be better to not talk about these people in order to avoid discrimination altogether. Thus, producers and directors would need to be especially careful while preparing materials that discuss any aspect of the LGBTQ community. Interestingly, in both films, there are prejudice terms that attack the LGBTQ community, and yet the movies do not present themselves as derogatory, or they don't have negative reviews. The reason for this can be derived if we closely examine the words of Dave Chappelle from his Sticks and Stones special. Chappelle presents an anecdote from his earlier years while producing a show called The Chappelle Show, which many of you, I'm sure, are aware of. He explains that there's a department called Standards and Practices that monitors his material to ensure that it is not offensive in the least. In one of his sketches, he used the word faggot and was asked to remove it. The woman working there explained that he was not allowed to make these kinds of jokes because he was not homosexual. The anecdote was used as the basis of Chappelle's argument, which is the concept of gender deviation is so fragile that it should not be discussed for fear of discrimination, which to him is ridiculous. If he is allowed to make jokes of all other facets of society and of facets of social and political constructs, you should be able to talk about the LGBTQ community. The comparison that he created in this scene was that he was allowed to make derogatory racial remarks, especially against his own race, but was not allowed to talk about members of the LGBTQ community. Chappelle furthers his argument with the strongest premise in any of the specials. He states, no matter what you do in your artistic expression, you are not to offend what he calls the alphabet people, people who took 20% of the alphabet for themselves. He's clearly, of course, referring to members of the LGBTQ community, saying they used 20% of the alphabet for the title of their organization. As he jokes about the name that they have chosen, he argues here that comedians, singers, journalists, and others are ostracized for shedding light to gender based issues as it relates to the LGBTQ community. Interestingly, Chappelle was bashed for some of the jokes and comments that he made about the LGBTQ community, like the one that I just mentioned. However, since these films present the hardship of the transgender community, the slurs referred the slurs featured in the films will not count as being derogatory. That's wild. Of course, that's clear double standard. The word faggot is a prejudice slur used against men that are attracted to men, whether they're gay or trans. And the word was used in the films, but of course, there were no backlashes for the film because they highlight the hardships that the transgender community members face. There's an interesting scene in Flawless where we see an interaction between the transgender women who are deemed as drag queens and gay men of political bodies. The groups are unable to see eye to eye, and Rusty explains that it is because gay men are ashamed of members of the transgender community. This suggests that there's some amount of tension in the LGBTQ community itself, aimed at transgender individuals. In Sticks and Stones special, Chappelle talks about this. Chappelle says, in a metaphor, that there's tension in the LGBTQ community. He coins that although it may seem as if they are all one movement, they are actually separate movements that just all travel in the same car. Hence, each of these individuals and each of these identities are fighting for their own equal rights, but they all refute gender identities being biological. The metaphor becomes even more complex as members of the LGBTQ community are categorized as passengers of a car who interact differently with each other. Special attention is given to transgender, which refers to as the T's. Chappelle states, everyone in the car respects the T's, but everybody in the car also resents the T's. It's not the T's fault, but everyone in the car just feels like the T's are making the trip take longer. Anything that T says gets on everybody's nerves, and then the T's don't even be saying anything bad. Those are Chappelle's words. Chappelle's uses the metaphor here. Chappelle's use of the metaphor here does a number of things. First, he indicates that there's a rift between the gay community, but pointing to the fact that other members of the gay community have a problem with transgender. This problem stems from the fact that for many years the gay community has fought for right to express who they are, and just as the United States of America has begun to accept them, the transgender community has additional requests. However, Chappelle absolves the transgender community of any responsibility in this regards. He states that this dislike is not their fault. The movie Flawless does the exact same thing. These individuals are trying to be themselves as other members of the LGBTQ community are doing, but they are met with discrimination because of their bold personalities and vulgar personas as depicted in the movie. There's a clear level of respect for the transgender community shown not only by the films but also by Chappelle. The discussion of what transgender means as well as presentation of their struggle is something that society needs to understand, and this discussion is important regardless of what genre it presents itself in. So I did a little research on a theorist called Michel Foucault, who was a French theorist. He states that discourses are not once and for all supervenient to power or raised up against it, any more than silences are. We must make allowances for the complex and unstable process whereby discourses can be both an instrument and an effect of power, but also a hindrance, a stumbling block, a point of resistance, and a starting point for an opposing strategy. Discourse transmits and produces power. It reinforces it, but also undermines and exposes it, renders it fragile, and makes it possible to thwart it. This is from Foucault's book called The History of Sexuality, Volume 1. Foucault points out that just as we are afraid that discussing certain topics may take power from the topics at hand, the very discussions may grant power to help to remove stigmas attached to them. All it does is highlight issues related to the topics so as to spark change. Therefore, can we really consider Chappelle's discussions as harmful, or the presentation of transgender in any film as harmful? His presentation of these issues helped to clarify questions that other members of society may have. One of the highlights of Foucault's discussion in his book was his hopes for a day where society would change to a state that was more accepting to what he called bodies of pleasure, so as to deconstruct the pre-existing structure of sexuality. This would give rise to more accepting society that would not label what was previously seen as acts of sexual deviance, but as individual desires. His premise here was for us to be more open to the idea of individuals desiring more than what was just the norm. So, the main theme presented in both films is acceptance, of course. It is the one thing that we find all transgender characters struggling to acquire. They want to be accepted for who they are, regardless of how you may or may not feel about the choices that they've made. This idea makes the title of Boys Don't Cry extremely dynamic. Tina Brandon wants to be a man, and so must endure because boys don't cry. The premise is as ridiculous as the saying itself. And so, even though the level of sarcasm we find that acceptance is important to all members of society, there's something in one of Chappelle's specials that we must highlight because it's extremely important to this discussion. I don't understand all the choices people make, but I do understand that life is hard. But those types of choices do not disqualify you from a life of dignity and happiness and safety in it. But if I am honest, my problem has never been with transgender people. It's always been with the dialogue about transgender people. Chappelle's words from Equilibrium. Chappelle emphatically refutes the notion that he has a problem with transgender people. His issue is with the sensitivity that has emerged around that community. And so he boldly jokes about issues relating to their lifestyle, hoping to shed light not only on what their choices are, but the fact that we need to accept those choices that are made by individuals of that community. In the movie Flawless, Rusty believes that he would never be accepted as a real man nor a real woman until he becomes the latter by completing his sex change operation. I spoke about this before. There is this same desire to complete a sex change operation in the other film, Boys Don't Cry. This procedure is more than a want to them, it's a necessity. There's something lacking and they will not feel complete unless they have this operation. VK Namaste wrote, they feel an imperative to obtain sex reassignment surgery based on severe and persistent cross-gender feelings, discomfort in gender role of their birth sex and distress that causes impairment in functioning in society. Those who do not seek to obtain sex reassignment surgery are perceived as having different issues from true transsexuals. The idea here is that there is some amount of displacement before the operation. The individual feels out of place and they are not accepted as a part of the struggle, which is why both characters were so eager to have the surgery in the first place in the movies that I mentioned. Transgenderism is an interesting topic for writing creative arts. It gives scope for writers and producers to create masterpieces. Both films selected were entertaining both films selected were entertaining and informative. They were captivating when they needed to be, while still being thought provoking enough to have the public consider consider the struggles faced by transgender individuals. Comparing the films to Dave Chappelle's special gave them a refreshing twist. His critique on how the audience view these issues was refreshing. It's very interesting to consider that some issues or people are off limit for discussions or jokes of any sort. It is clear that although some may not like the topic of Chappelle's jokes, it is clear that his intention is not to discriminate towards the transgender community. Um, I hope you enjoyed this video, and feel free to check out the films. Again, they are Boys Don't Cry and Flawless. Enjoy the rest of your night.